In the bitter cold of the Winter War, Finnish soldiers wielded a weapon dismissed by their Soviet foes as nothing more than an ugly pipe. The Lahti L-39, a cumbersome anti-tank rifle, seemed an unlikely contender against the might of Soviet armor. But as the tanks rolled forward, confident in their superiority, the Lahti L-39 proved its worth. With one well-aimed shot, a T-26 tank was sent up in flames, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the battle. This ugly pipe would go on to cripple Soviet tanks, shattering the illusion of invincibility and turning the tide for the Finnish forces. The Lahti L-39 was more than just a rifle. It became a symbol of resistance, showing the Soviets that underestimating their enemy would come at a high price. The Finnish soldiers lay hidden among the snow-covered trees, their dark figures barely visible in the early morning light. The air was cold, and the silence of the forest was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of Soviet tanks advancing through the snow. The ground trembled slightly with each rumble, sending small tremors through the men lying in wait. They were positioned in the heart of Finland's frozen wilderness, ready to defend their land from the unstoppable force of the Soviet invasion. The Soviet tanks, particularly the T-26 and BT-7, had been moving through the Finnish defenses with ease, crushing anything in their path. To the Soviet soldiers, the war was a simple matter of overwhelming force. They had the numbers, the equipment, and the firepower to crush the small Finnish army. What they didn't count on was the determination of the Finnish soldiers and the unexpected power of their strange weapon, the Lahti L-39 anti-tank rifle. The Lahti L-39 was unlike anything the Soviets had seen before. It was bulky, heavy, and had the appearance of a giant steel pipe. In fact, the Soviet troops often mocked the weapon, calling it the ugly pipe. It was a far cry from the sleek, powerful tanks that were invading Finland. To the Soviets, it seemed almost laughable. How could a single rifle, especially one that looked so awkward, possibly have any effect against their advanced tanks? But the Finnish soldiers were not laughing. They knew something that the Soviets did. The Lahti L-39 was not about looks or ease of use. It was about stopping the Soviet tanks at any cost. The weapon was capable of firing a massive 20mm round, enough to penetrate the armor of the Soviet tanks. However, it came with its own set of challenges. The rifle was so large and heavy that only the strongest soldiers could carry and fire it effectively. Recoil was another problem. Each shot came with a violent kick, making it difficult to control. But despite its unwieldy nature, the Finnish soldiers believed in its power. As the tanks grew closer, the tension among the Finnish soldiers increased. The snow was thick underfoot, the bitter cold numbing their hands and faces. They huddled close, hands gripping their weapons tightly, their eyes fixed on the advancing Soviet tanks. The tanks were a formidable sight, massive machines of destruction with thick armor and powerful guns, moving forward with no hesitation. The Soviet soldiers inside were confident, certain that nothing could stop them now. But the Finnish soldiers knew otherwise. They had seen the Lahti L-39's action before, and it had proven capable of piercing the armor of even the heaviest tanks. The problem was that they had to get close enough for the shot. The Lahti L-39 was not a long-range weapon. It had a relatively short effective range, and if the Finnish soldiers were discovered too early, they would have no chance to fire. The tanks were nearly upon them now, their tracks churning up the snow as they rumbled forward. The Finnish soldiers held their breath, watching the massive machines approach, trying to stay as still as possible. The sound of the Soviet tanks grew louder, drowning out the natural sounds of the forest. The tension was almost unbearable. A single mistake, a single movement, and everything would be lost. Then, With a sudden burst of motion, one of the Finnish soldiers raised the Lahti L-39, aiming at the closest Soviet tank. The others watched in silence, knowing that this moment would define their fate. The rifle was heavy in the soldier's hands, but he steadied himself, his focus narrowing onto the target. He fired. The sound of the shot was deafening, a deep, resonating boom that echoed through the frozen forest. The massive round tore through the air and struck the Soviet T-26 tank squarely in its side. The tank erupted into flames, the explosion lighting up the snowy landscape. The Soviet soldiers inside were thrown into chaos, unable to comprehend what had just happened. In an instant, their overconfidence had turned into shock. The laughter that had filled the air just moments before was replaced by stunned silence. The Soviet tanks, which had seemed so invincible, were now vulnerable. The first shot from the Lahti L-39 had crippled one of their most powerful machines, proving that the ugly pipe was not so laughable after all. The Finnish soldiers, hidden in the trees, watched the burning tank with a mixture of disbelief and triumph. They had done it. The impossible had been achieved, but the battle was far from over. The Soviets quickly regrouped, their initial shock wearing off as they realized that they were under attack by a force they had underestimated. They began to move more cautiously, scanning the trees for any sign of the Finnish soldiers. The Finnish forces, emboldened by their success, fired again, taking out another Soviet tank. With each shot, the Lahti L-39 proved its worth. But the Soviet forces were not going to give up easily. The Finnish soldiers knew that they had gained an important advantage, but they also understood that they couldn't rely on the Lahti L-39 alone. The Soviets had more tanks, more men, and more firepower. The Lahti L-39 had turned the tide in a single moment, but the battle was just beginning. The Finns would have to use every resource at their disposal to keep the Soviet forces at bay. The snow continued to fall around them, thickening the air as the two forces prepared for the next round of the fight. The Lahti L-39, once dismissed as a mere curiosity, had proven to be one of Finland's most powerful weapons. It was not just a rifle. It was a symbol of the determination and resourcefulness of the Finnish people, a weapon forged in the harshest conditions, used by soldiers who refused to back down. The battle for Finland was far from over, but the Lahti L-39 had already written its place in history. The Soviet tanks, stunned by the first devastating shot, now began to retreat. The fire from the Lahti L-39 had shattered their confidence, but the advantage was short-lived. The battlefield was still filled with the rumbling sounds of more Soviet vehicles. Their tactics quickly shifted. They weren't going to let a single setback stop them. The Soviet soldiers inside the tanks had underestimated the Finnish forces. But now, they were learning quickly. The Finnish soldiers, hidden in the snow, knew the Lahti L-39 could not keep up the fight alone. They had one shot, sometimes two, before the Soviets would react, and the next assault would be even more difficult. The rifle's limited range and awkward design meant that any mistake could lead to disaster. The Soviet tanks, after recovering from their initial shock, began to spread out and move more cautiously. They knew the Finns were somewhere out there in the snow, but they couldn't quite locate them. The Lahti L-39, despite its heavy size, was powerful enough to create a lethal opening. Finnish soldiers had been trained to fire at the weak spots of the Soviet tanks, aiming for the tracks and the sides, where armor was thinner. But each shot was critical. The Lahti L-39 wasn't a rapid-fire weapon. It was a single, powerful shot, with each pull of the trigger. Once they fired, the Finnish soldiers needed to hide again, repositioning quickly to avoid being discovered. They had to be patient, relying on the Lahti's power to disrupt the Soviet forces one tank at a time. The Soviet infantry, emboldened by their tanks, began pushing forward in greater numbers. They thought they could overwhelm the Finnish resistance. They knew that the tanks were the backbone of the Soviet assault, and as long as those tanks were moving, they could push the Finns back. The infantry advanced cautiously, watching for any signs of movement from the Finns. The snow, thick and powdery, made it difficult to see far ahead. The Finns, however, were at an advantage. They knew the land better. They were used to the cold, to moving silently through the white wilderness. They were hunting. Every now and then, the sound of Soviet tanks could be heard, rolling through the forest, their engines growling in the distance. Each time, one of the Finnish soldiers raised the Lahti L-39 and fired, a Soviet tank would be crippled or destroyed. The Soviet soldiers inside would scatter, scrambling to escape, and then the Finns would disappear back into the woods, leaving behind the destruction they had caused. The Soviet commanders, now fully aware of the threat posed by the Lahti L-39, issued new orders. They began to deploy their forces more carefully, no longer advancing in the same concentrated formations. They spread out, attempting to limit the damage the Lahti L-39 could inflict. But the Finns were not done. They had learned from their first success, and they were using the environment to their advantage. Every shot from the Lahti L-39 was calculated, designed to cause as much chaos as possible while remaining undetected. The fighting grew more intense. The Soviets, frustrated by their losses, began calling in artillery support. The ground shook as shells exploded around the Finnish positions. The snow was kicked up into the air, obscuring vision and making it even harder for the Finns to stay hidden. The Finnish soldiers, however, were not easily shaken. They had grown used to the constant threat of artillery and gunfire. They knew how to move quietly and quickly, and they understood that the battle wasn't just about firepower, it was about survival. With the Soviet artillery raining down, the Finnish soldiers had to adjust their strategy. They began to move more frequently, setting up new positions and using the Lahti L-39 as a tool of disruption rather than as a weapon of mass destruction. They had to be nimble and use every advantage the terrain gave them. They kept the Soviets off balance, never staying in one spot for too long, always moving with the wind, the snow, and the shadows. The tension in the air was thick. The Soviets were determined to break the Finnish lines, but they had underestimated the tenacity of the Finnish forces. Each Soviet tank that fell to the Lahti L-39 was a blow to their morale, a reminder that the Finns were not going to go down easily. But the Soviets were relentless. They had vast numbers and resources at their disposal. They could replace their tanks, their infantry, and their artillery faster than the Finns could destroy them. As the days passed, the fighting began to shift. The Lahti L-39 had done its job, but the Finns knew they could not rely on it alone. The Soviet forces were advancing in greater numbers, and the Finns had to find a way to slow them down even more. The Lahti L-39 had proven that the Soviets could be hurt, but it was also clear that the Lahti L-39 alone wouldn't win the war. The Soviet tanks were still coming, and the Finns had to adapt, think differently, and act quickly. The air was bitter cold, but the fire of resistance burned bright in the hearts of the Finnish soldiers. They were a small force, outmatched and outnumbered, but they had a single, unyielding advantage: the will to fight. And as long as they could keep disrupting the Soviet advance, they would continue to hold their ground. The Lahti L-39 was just one part of that fight, but it was a powerful reminder that even the most unlikely weapons could change the course of history. The Finnish soldiers weren't going to stop now. The Soviets had underestimated them once, but that would be their last mistake. With the Lahti L-39, with their knowledge of the land, and with their unbreakable resolve, the Finnish forces would keep fighting one tank at a time. The Soviets might have the numbers, but the Finns had something far more powerful: the determination to survive and to defend their home at all costs. The fighting had now intensified, and the Soviets, enraged by their mounting losses, pushed forward with even more force. They had regrouped, reorganized, and were now adapting to the challenge posed by the Finnish resistance. The once imposing Soviet tanks seemed less invulnerable now, their ranks thinned by the fire of the Lahti L-39. Yet, the Soviets were determined to not be beaten by a handful of Finnish soldiers and an unorthodox weapon. The battle had escalated into a war of attrition, and the Soviets were willing to sacrifice whatever it took to crush the resistance. As the snow continued to fall, covering the battlefield in a thick blanket of white, the Soviets started deploying more advanced tactics. The Finnish forces, however, were not caught off guard. They had studied the enemy's movements and knew how to use the terrain to their advantage. The dense forests and frozen lakes that surrounded them were not just obstacles for the Soviet forces, they were tools for the Finns. They moved silently, their skis gliding effortlessly over the snow, blending with the white landscape. Every movement was calculated, every decision made with precision. The Finns were experts in guerrilla warfare, and the Soviet tanks, so powerful and massive, had become their primary targets. The Lahti L-39, with its massive frame and powerful round, was more than just a weapon. It had become a symbol of the Finnish resistance. While the Soviets had tanks that could crush whole villages, the Finns had something more valuable: the element of surprise. The Lahti L-39, though slow to reload and difficult to handle, was lethal in the right hands. A well-aimed shot could bring down a Soviet tank in an instant, and that was all the Finns needed. With every tank they destroyed, they gained more confidence. But the Soviet response was swift. They began to send more infantry to scout ahead, searching for the elusive Finnish soldiers hiding in the snow. The Lahti L-39 continued to find its mark. With every shot, another Soviet tank was neutralized. However, it wasn't just the Lahti L-39 that was making a difference. The Finnish forces had begun to use their environment as their greatest weapon. They knew the forest paths better than anyone. The Soviets, despite their overwhelming numbers, were constantly thrown off balance. As soon as they advanced in one direction, the Finns would slip away and strike from another angle. It was a battle of patience and endurance, and the Finns were experts at both. Despite their success, the Finns were feeling the strain. The constant bombardment from Soviet artillery, the freezing temperatures, and the never-ending threat of Soviet tanks were beginning to take their toll. The Lahti L-39, though effective, was still a heavy, cumbersome weapon. Its recoil was brutal, and each shot left the Finnish soldiers exhausted. But they had no choice. They had to keep fighting, and they had to make every shot count. In the midst of the chaos, the Soviets began to change their approach. They started to spread their forces out more, reducing the concentration of their tanks and infantry in any one area. This was an effort to minimize the damage caused by the Lahti L-39. The Finns, however, were ready for this. They knew that if they were going to stop the Soviets, they would have to strike hard and fast before the Soviets could regroup and adjust their tactics. The situation grew increasingly dire as more Soviet tanks rolled into the battlefield. The Finns were running low on ammunition, and the Lahti L-39 wasn't the kind of weapon you could fire endlessly. Each shot was carefully planned, and there was a growing fear that the weapon wouldn't be able to keep up with the Soviet onslaught. The Soviets, sensing the shift in momentum, pushed harder, sending wave after wave of troops and tanks into the Finnish lines. The terrain, once an advantage for the Finns, was now a hindrance. The snow made it difficult to maneuver quickly, and the freezing conditions were beginning to sap the energy of the Finnish soldiers. As the Soviets advanced, they began to deploy even more tanks, bringing out their heavy artillery and more advanced armored vehicles. The Finns, however, were not yet ready to give up. They had learned to use their surroundings in ways the Soviets had never anticipated. As the Soviets sent tanks forward, the Finnish soldiers fired again, their Lahti L-39 seconds, taking out more tanks and forcing the Soviet advance to slow. Each successful shot was a victory, but the Soviets were relentless. They had the numbers, and they were willing to keep pressing forward. In the midst of the chaos, the Finnish soldiers could feel the pressure building. The Soviets were adapting, and their tactics were becoming more difficult to counter. The Lahti L-39, despite its power, was becoming less effective against the increasing number of Soviet tanks. The Finnish forces had to think quickly and find new ways to disrupt the Soviet advance. They couldn't afford to rely on just one weapon. They needed to combine their tactics, their knowledge of the land, and their relentless will to survive. As the Soviets closed in, the Finns knew that they had to strike again. The Lahti L-39 was still a valuable weapon, but it couldn't win the war on its own. The Finnish forces began to dig in, preparing for a final stand. They knew that they had one shot to turn the tide before the Soviets could push them back completely. The Lahti L-39, for all its flaws, had already proven its worth. It had stopped Soviet tanks, it had shattered the Soviet sense of invincibility, and it had shown that Finland would not go down without a fight. The tension in the air was palpable. The Lahti L-39 had become more than just a weapon. It had become a symbol of resistance, and the Soviets, no matter how many tanks they sent, could no longer ignore the impact of that ugly pipe. The battle had changed, and the outcome was still in the balance. But the Finns were not ready to give up. They would keep fighting, no matter how difficult it became. They knew that as long as they had the Lahti L-39, they had a chance to win. The battle was reaching a critical point. The snow that had once been a silent ally to the Finnish soldiers now seemed to work against them. With each passing day, the Soviets seemed to adapt. The massive Soviet tanks were not as easily defeated as they once were. The Finns had struck hard and fast, but the Soviet forces were relentless. New tactics were being employed, and more advanced weaponry was rolling onto the battlefield. The Lahti L-39, despite its early success, was starting to show its limitations. The Finnish soldiers were feeling the strain of the ongoing fight. The cold was unbearable, the endless snow piling higher and higher, making it harder to move through the forest. The Lahti L-39, while still effective, was becoming more difficult to handle in these harsh conditions. Its recoil, already brutal, felt even more punishing with each shot. The soldiers who fired it were exhausted, their hands numb from the freezing temperatures. But despite the toll it was taking, they couldn't afford to stop. Each shot counted, and they had no choice but to keep firing. The Soviet tanks were advancing in greater numbers. The first wave of Soviet tanks had been shattered by the Lahti L-39, but now the Soviets were adjusting their strategies. They spread their tanks out across the battlefield, making it harder for the Finns to pick them off one by one. They also began to send in infantry in greater numbers, hoping to find and eliminate the Finnish soldiers hiding in the snow. The Soviets were no longer underestimating their enemies. They were determined to crush the Finnish resistance once and for all. The Finns had to adapt quickly. The Lahti L-39 had proven effective, but it was clear that it could not single-handedly stop the Soviet advance. The Soviets were now employing larger formations, moving with more precision. The Finns, though outnumbered, were not easily defeated. They had a deep understanding of the terrain, and they used that knowledge to their advantage. The dense forests and frozen lakes were still their allies, providing cover and concealment. But the Soviets were relentless. With every tank destroyed, more were sent in to take its place. The Finnish soldiers, though weary, continued to hold their ground. It was becoming clear that this was no longer just a battle of firepower. It was a battle of endurance. The Lahti L-39 had helped the Finns land some powerful blows, but now it was time for the soldiers to rely on their wits. They had to use every advantage they could find to disrupt the Soviet forces. The Lahti L-39 could still take out a Soviet tank with one well-placed shot, but the Finns needed to find ways to slow the Soviets down, to keep them from regrouping and launching another attack. The Soviets, seeing the effectiveness of the Lahti L-39, began to adapt their tactics even further. They started using smoke screens to obscure the Finnish soldiers' line of sight. The smoke rolled across the battlefield, making it harder for the Finns to get clear shots. The Soviets also began to deploy armored infantry carriers, giving their soldiers better protection as they advanced. The Finns could still see the tanks, but they were becoming more difficult to target. The Lahti L-39, with its heavy recoil and limited range, was struggling to keep up with the rapidly changing situation. But the Finnish soldiers were not deterred. They knew they couldn't rely on just one weapon to win this fight. They adapted, switching from a focus on tanks to disrupting Soviet infantry. They set traps, ambushing Soviet soldiers who were too far ahead of the main tank columns. They used the forests as cover, attacking from unexpected directions. The Soviets, caught off guard by these guerrilla tactics, struggled to adjust. Their tanks and infantry were powerful, but the Finns were more mobile, more elusive. In the midst of all this, the Lahti L-39 remained a symbol of Finnish determination. It was a reminder to the Soviets that their tanks, no matter how advanced, were not invulnerable. The Lahti L-39 had proven itself to be more than just a crude weapon. It had become a powerful symbol of resistance, showing the Soviets that the Finnish soldiers would not give up, no matter the odds. But even with the Lahti L-39 and the ingenuity of the Finnish forces, it was clear that the war was far from over. The Soviets had suffered significant losses, but they were still sending in reinforcements, still pushing forward. The Lahti L-39 could only do so much. The Finnish soldiers knew that their survival depended on more than just one weapon. They needed to hold their ground, adapt their tactics, and continue to use their surroundings to their advantage. The battle had turned into a desperate struggle for both sides. The Lahti L-39 had taken down many Soviet tanks, but the Finns were now facing a much larger Soviet offensive. The Soviets had learned from their mistakes and were coming in with even more force. The Finns could still take down tanks, but they couldn't stop the entire Soviet machine. The war was not over, and both sides knew that it was going to take everything they had to emerge victorious. The snow continued to fall heavily around them, the cold seeping into their bones. The battle was far from over, but the Finnish soldiers were still holding their ground. The Lahti L-39 had proven itself in the early stages, but the road ahead was going to be much harder. The Soviets were relentless, and the Finns had to adapt to survive. The war was now a test of endurance, and it wasn't clear who would come out on top, but one thing was certain. The Lahti L-39 would continue to play a pivotal role in the fight, a reminder that even the most unlikely weapons could change the course of history. The Finnish forces were feeling the weight of the ongoing battle. The Soviets, relentless as ever, had adapted to the tactics that had once thrown them off balance. New waves of tanks, soldiers, and artillery pushed forward, attempting to break through the Finnish defenses. The snow continued to fall heavily, blanketing the battlefield in a cold, quiet layer that hid the destruction beneath. For the Finnish soldiers, this was the toughest phase of the fight yet. The Lahti L-39, despite its early successes, was now only one part of the equation. The situation had shifted. The Soviets had learned from their losses and were coming at them with even greater force. But the Finns were not ready to give up. The Lahti L-39, though powerful, was still a cumbersome weapon. Its recoil was brutal, and the cold made handling it even more difficult. But in the hands of determined Finnish soldiers, it was still capable of taking down Soviet tanks with a single shot. The problem was that the Soviets were now more cautious, more spread out, making it harder to get clear shots. The Soviets had also increased their use of smoke screens, which made it difficult for the Finnish soldiers to see their targets. The Lahti L-39, with its limited range and accuracy, was no longer the ultimate solution. But the Finnish soldiers didn't give up. They used their knowledge of the terrain, their skill in guerrilla warfare, and their determination to keep the Soviet forces at bay. The Soviets, on the other hand, were increasingly frustrated. Despite their numbers, they were unable to break the Finnish lines. Each time they pushed forward, they faced another ambush, another hidden shot from the Lahti L-39, and another tank down. Their infantry was advancing, but the Finns knew how to strike quickly and retreat into the forest, disappearing into the snow-covered trees before the Soviets could retaliate. The Soviets began to realize that this battle wasn't going to be as easy as they had first thought. They were facing an enemy that had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. In the midst of the heavy fighting, the Finnish soldiers found moments of success. Every Soviet tank destroyed, every infantry soldier picked off from a distance was a small victory, a sign that they could still hold their ground. But the reality was that the Soviets had more resources, more soldiers, and more tanks. The Lahti L-39 had done its job in the early stages of the battle, but now it was becoming clear that the Finnish forces needed more than just one weapon to win. They needed to keep adapting, keep finding new ways to disrupt the Soviet advance. The Soviets, meanwhile, were adjusting their strategy. They had learned to avoid the Finnish traps, to spread out their tanks, and to use their smoke screens more effectively. But the Finns weren't ready to give up. The tension between the two sides continued to grow. The Soviets were sending wave after wave of tanks and infantry, pushing forward with determination. The Finnish soldiers, exhausted but resolute, fired back from their positions in the snow. The Lahti L-39 continued to fire, taking out tanks one by one, but the Soviets had started to send more and more armored vehicles into the battle. The Finnish soldiers knew that they had to find a way to slow the Soviet advance, to buy themselves more time. They couldn't rely on just one weapon anymore. They needed to use everything they had to keep the Soviets from breaking through. As the fighting wore on, it became clear that the battle was no longer just about tanks and rifles. It was about survival. The Finns had proven they could take out Soviet tanks, but they were running low on ammunition, and the Soviets were beginning to overwhelm them with sheer numbers. The Lahti L-39, for all its power, was becoming less and less effective against the increasing Soviet presence. The soldiers who fired it were growing tired, their hands frozen and their muscles aching from the recoil. They had to keep fighting. Though the Soviets were not going to stop until they had wiped them out. The weather, once an advantage, was now working against them. The snow was falling heavily, making it harder for the Finnish soldiers to move quickly or see their targets. The Soviet tanks, with their thick armor and firepower, were now advancing in greater numbers. The Finnish soldiers, despite their best efforts, were struggling to keep up, but they didn't give up. They dug in, using the snow for cover, setting up new positions in the forest and moving quickly to avoid detection. They used the Lahti L-39 as much as they could, but they knew that they couldn't rely on it alone. The Soviets, despite their increasing numbers and artillery, couldn't break the Finnish lines. The Lahti L-39 had proven itself a powerful tool, but the true strength of the Finnish forces lay in their ability to adapt and survive. They knew how to fight in the snow, how to move quietly, how to use the terrain to their advantage. They couldn't outmatch the Soviets in numbers or firepower, but they could outlast them, and that was exactly what they did. The battle reached a boiling point. The Soviets, unable to make significant progress, began to grow desperate. Their tanks were being destroyed one by one, and their infantry was constantly under attack. The Lahti L-39 had played a critical role in stopping the Soviet advance, but now the Soviets were beginning to pull back, regrouping to rethink their strategy. They had underestimated the Finns at the start of the battle, but now they were learning the hard way that the Finnish resistance was not so easily defeated. Despite the mounting pressure, the Finns refused to back down. They had proven that even the most unlikely weapon could make a difference. The Lahti L-39 had done more than just damage Soviet tanks. It had shattered their sense of invincibility. The Soviets, no matter how many tanks or soldiers they sent, could not ignore the Finnish spirit. The battle was far from over, but the Lahti L-39 had already helped turn the tide. The Soviets had underestimated the Finns once, but they would not make that mistake again. The Finnish forces were still standing, still fighting, and they were not about to give up. The war was shifting. The Soviets had lost more than they had expected, and the Finns, though exhausted and outnumbered, had proven that they would not be crushed. The Lahti L-39, once dismissed as an ugly, clumsy weapon, had played a key role in the defense of Finland. It had become more than just a tool. It had become a symbol of the Finnish resistance. And as long as the Finns held on to that spirit, they had a chance to win. The snow had become a heavy blanket, piling up around the soldiers as they continued their fight against the Soviet forces. The Lahti L-39 had proven itself time and again, taking down Soviet tanks and stopping their advance. However, the Soviets were still pressing on. The battle had been long, and both sides were showing signs of exhaustion. The Finns, though worn down, were not ready to give up. They knew that they had to keep fighting, that they had to hold the line for as long as possible. The Soviets, too, were feeling the pressure. They had underestimated the Finnish resistance and had paid for it. But now, as the battle dragged on, they were becoming more determined, pushing harder with each passing day. The Finns, despite their exhaustion, still had a powerful advantage: their knowledge of the land. The thick forests and frozen terrain that had once been an obstacle for both sides had become an advantage for the Finnish soldiers. They knew how to use the snow to hide, how to blend in with the environment, and how to strike quickly before disappearing back into the forest. The Soviets, with their larger forces and heavier equipment, were at a disadvantage when it came to maneuvering in the harsh conditions. The Finns had mastered the art of survival in the snow and were using it to their full advantage. But the Soviets had not given up. They were determined to crush the Finnish resistance. They had more tanks, more soldiers, and more artillery. They knew that the Finns could not keep up the fight forever. The battle had reached a turning point. The Soviets were pushing harder than ever, determined to break through the Finnish lines. The Lahti L-39, though still a powerful weapon, was now just one part of the equation. The Finns had to rely on their endurance, their resourcefulness, and their ability to adapt. The battle was no longer just about firepower. It was about holding on, about surviving until the end. The Soviets were throwing everything they had at the Finnish soldiers: tanks, artillery, and infantry were all being sent in waves to break through the defenses. The Finns, though outnumbered, were still holding their ground. Every shot from the Lahti L-39 counted. Every destroyed tank was a victory, but the Soviet forces were relentless. The Finns knew that they couldn't keep fighting this way forever. The Lahti L-39 had become more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the Finnish spirit, of their refusal to back down in the face of overwhelming odds. The Soviet tanks, once thought to be invincible, were now vulnerable to a weapon that had been dismissed as ineffective. The Lahti L-39 had shattered the Soviet sense of invincibility and had shown them that the Finns would not be crushed. But as the battle raged on, it became clear that the Finns could not rely on the Lahti L-39 alone. The Soviets had more tanks, more men, and more artillery. The Finnish forces were running low on ammunition and were exhausted from the constant fighting. They had to find a way to hold out, to survive long enough for the Soviets to finally withdraw. The Lahti L-39 had done its job, but the battle was not over yet. The Soviet forces, despite their initial shock at the effectiveness of the Lahti L-39, were beginning to adapt. They had learned from their mistakes and were adjusting their tactics. They began to deploy more advanced tanks, ones that were better armored and more difficult to destroy. They also increased the use of smoke screens, making it harder for the Finnish soldiers to target their tanks. The Finns, however, were still determined. They continued to use their surroundings to their advantage, striking quickly and retreating into the snow before the Soviets could retaliate. The tension was palpable. Both sides knew that this battle would determine the outcome of the Winter War. The Soviets were pushing forward with everything they had, while the Finns were holding on with all their strength. The Lahti L-39, though no longer the ultimate weapon, was still a powerful tool in the Finnish arsenal. But the real strength of the Finnish forces lay in their resolve. They were not going to let the Soviets take their land. As the Soviet tanks advanced, the Lahti L-39 continued to take its toll. With each shot, another Soviet tank was destroyed. The Soviets were losing ground, and they knew that they could not continue the assault forever. The Finnish forces, though outnumbered and exhausted, had proven that they could stand their ground. The Lahti L-39 had become a symbol of their resistance, a reminder that even the most unlikely weapon could change the course of a battle. The battle for Finland was far from over, but the tide had started to turn. The Soviets were retreating, their tanks destroyed, their infantry scattered. The Finns had held their ground, had fought with everything they had, and had proven that they would not be defeated. The Lahti L-39, once mocked for its size and awkward design, had played a pivotal role in that victory. It had become a symbol of the Finnish resistance, of their ability to fight against overwhelming odds. In the end, the Soviets were forced to acknowledge the power of the Lahti L-39. They had underestimated it, just as they had underestimated the Finnish soldiers. The Lahti L-39 had proven that even the most unlikely weapons could have a decisive impact on the battlefield. And as the battle came to a close, the Finnish soldiers knew that they had done the impossible. They had stopped the Soviet advance, and in doing so, had shown the world that even the smallest forces could make a difference. The Lahti L-39 had earned its place in history. It was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol of the Finnish spirit, a reminder that no matter how large or powerful the enemy, there was always a way to fight back. The Soviets may have had the numbers, but the Finns had something far more important, the will to survive. And with that, they had secured a victory that would be remembered for generations to come.